Welcome to the Carnegie Council. We consider it a matter of good fortune to be hosting Andrew Bacevich today. Professor Bacevich will be talking about America's military and security conduct since 1941 and why it must change. I'm Joanne Myers, Director of Public Affairs Programs, and on behalf of the Carnegie Council, I'd like to thank you for joining us. And as Joel already mentioned, a special thank you to Robert James for his ongoing support of the Carnegie Council, and especially for his attendance at our public affairs events and his invaluable comments. Bob, there is no question but that you have established yourself as a very good friend of the Carnegie Council. I know I speak for all of us gathered here to say how much we always look forward to having Professor Bacevich address us. With each one of his publications, Professor Bacevich knows how to engage us to think about the important topics of the day. That being said, when you leave here this afternoon, you too may find that what's on his mind may be on yours, as it will become difficult to ignore his argument and contentions about U.S. foreign policy and U.S. militarism. In Washington Rules, America's Path to Permanent War, Professor Bacevich writes that in thinking about his own life and his time as a military officer, he realized that American power, policies, and purpose were bound together in a consistent package, each element drawing strength and reinforcement from each other, but that always to a productive end. This was especially true during the Cold War. Yet, at the end of the Cold War, which just so happened to coincide with the end of his military career, he found that the familiar narrative about our national security was no longer viable. Instead, he discovered perplexing riddles about U.S. military practices. To find the answers to what he viewed as contradictions and misperceptions about the threats posed by American adversaries, our speaker set out on an intellectual journey to critically analyze the past. No longer a soldier, and with the independence of a scholar, Professor Bacevich began to examine the past 60 years of U.S. military policy. He found a disturbing pattern of U.S. military practice that committed us to a permanent national security crisis. The evidence is as follows: a policy which reveals an abiding conviction that the minimum essential for international peace and order requires the United States, and us alone, to maintain a global military presence around the world. We design our forces to project global power so that we are ready to intervene anywhere at any time according to the way we believe the international order should work. From the expansionist era of SAC's General Curtis LeMay and CIA Director Allen Dulles, through successive governments since World War II, Professor Bacevich challenges these basic precepts of power, presence, and intervention to demonstrate that these ideas are neither a Democrat or a Republican approach to military policy, but a government institutional model that all presidents have bought into. He argues that this practice has benefited the political, military, and business establishment while doing little for the country's security or domestic prosperity. The world today looks different than it did just a decade ago, yet for the past 60 years, the basic assumptions of America's military policy have remained unchanged. Professor Bacevich says that while these policies might have made some sense in 1945, today the so-called Washington Rules have relegated America to a condition of permanent national security crisis approximating perpetual war. Attempting to prolong its existence might serve Washington's interests, but it will not serve the interests of the American people. If you are interested in our national security and the future of our country, you will not find a more persuasive argument for changing our country's direction. Please join me in welcoming a man not afraid to challenge conventional wisdom and talk about issues. Our guest today, Andrew Bacevich.
Well, thank you very much for this opportunity to speak to you today. I'm very grateful for that. My plan is to speak fairly briefly because my experience is that on occasions such as this, you're only pretending to come because you want to hear me. You're actually, you're actually coming because you have something important to say. But quite seriously, I do think that it is in the discussion and the exchange that I know I have more fun, and I suspect that you have fun as well. I'll also speak briefly because Actually, the content of the talk is a summary of the book, which you've just heard, incredibly competently and more succinctly than I was going to offer. The object of the exercise really was I was going to try to tell you what the book is about, hoping that you wouldn't say at the end of the talk, well, I got that, now I understand, so there's no need for me to look at the book. The object of the exercise was to sort of tickle you and tease you and to have you say at the end of the talk, oh, I must not only buy that, but I have to buy multiple copies for all of my grandchildren and my neighbors, for my book club, the Manhattan Book Club, the Oprah Book Club. Oprah, are you out there? So, two questions. The first, a question that I think is on many of our minds. The second, a question that still haunts, I think, people of my generation, maybe many of you here. The first question is, why are we in Afghanistan? And the second question is, why were we in Vietnam? Two questions, I think, one answer. We are in Afghanistan, we were in Vietnam, because Washington stubbornly adheres to a national security consensus consisting of 2 points. I'm going to give you those points. But before I do, it was fun talking to Mr. Barnett here during the period before the luncheon. Mr. Barnett, who seems amazing, worked during World War II for the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Ernest King, a remarkable figure, frankly largely forgotten in our history, sad to say. And what occurred to me as I was sitting here having my lunch is, although I think there is a common answer to why we were in Vietnam and why we are in Afghanistan, the same answer does not apply to why we fought World War II. And the point I want to make in saying that is that this national security consensus, which I will attempt to describe and that I will decry, is certainly something that has existed for a considerable period of time now, I think since the very beginning of the Cold War. But that doesn't mean it has existed forever. There was a time when Americans chose to go to war or chose not to go to war based on a series of considerations, based on an analysis that was not determined by some sort of preset set of assumptions or convictions. And I think it's important for us to remember that. It is not as if a great power is condemned to continue to follow a certain path. I mean, were that to be the case, why be a great power? There was a time when a core conviction in forming our approach to foreign policy and national security policy is that we ought to determine our own fate based on a sober calculation of what serves the interests of the American people. So that was kind of a long parenthetical comment. And let me go back to the text. So 2 questions, 1 answer. The answer is a national security consensus. Let me try to describe that consensus and its 2 main elements. The first I call in the book the American credo. And the American credo is an effort to define purpose of national security policy. And the second element I call in the book the sacred Trinity. The sacred Trinity defines practice. The claim made by the American credo is that we are summoned. The United States is summoned. And the United States alone is summoned to lead, save, liberate, and ultimately transform the world. I teach a course at Boston University called Ideas in American Foreign Policy. It's my absolute, total, complete favorite course that I teach And what we do in this course is we don't use textbooks. What we do is we invite, encourage, even insist that our students, my students, will read a set of documents which I have chosen, documents which, this is kind of the conceit of the course, either have shaped the way we think about foreign policy or has shaped the critique that evolves relative to foreign policy. And the very first document that we read in this course is the sermon given on the decks of the good ship Arabella in 1630 off the coast of a place that is about to become Boston by John Winthrop, describing the purpose of this community that he, as the leader of this small group of people, is about to found in what is about to become New England, what is going to be the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And of course, he begins by saying, by insisting that the purpose of this community is determined by a covenant between the community and God himself. And that what God commands and what God expects is that this community will serve as a city upon a hill. That famous phrase of John Winthrop's, which of course periodically gets revived in our political discourse, and in many respects, I think, holds the absolute key to understanding the basis of how we define our relations to the rest of the world. That we are called upon, we are chosen. If you're a believer, chosen by God. If you're not a believer, chosen by providence or chosen by history. And that our purpose is ultimately a redeeming purpose. This understanding of purpose, this American credo, expressed in different words at different times by different leaders, I think has to be understood as, in some respects, the absolute foundation of this national security consensus that I try to describe. But there's that second piece, the sacred Trinity. And according to the sacred Trinity, the minimum essentials of international peace and order require the United States, and we have to emphasize, again, the United States alone, to maintain a global military presence, to configure our forces not to defend the country. For the Pentagon, the defense of the United States of America proper actually serves very much as an afterthought. That's why after 9/11 we had to create a whole other cabinet department called the Department of Homeland Security to defend the country. We can configure our forces not to defend the country, but to provide instruments for global power projection. Global military presence, forces configured for global power projection. These two married together to provide the third element of the sacred Trinity, namely support for policies that rely on a pattern of global interventionism. Now, together, credo and Trinity constitute the essence of the way that Washington, and by Washington here I really mean our governing classes, the institutions and people that in one way or another have the ability to sort of reach out and put their thumb on the helm that drives the ship of state. Credo and Trinity constitute the essence of the way that Washington has attempted to govern and to police what Henry Luce dubbed, back in 1941, the American century. The sacred Trinity lends plausibility to the credo's vast claims. The credo justifies the Trinity's vast requirements and vast exertions. Together, credo and Trinity define the rules to which Washington adheres, and they determine the precepts by which Washington has attempted and still attempts to rule. Yet there's a problem. And the problem is that the rules don't work. At least they don't work any longer. Indeed, blind adherence to the Washington rules is proving to be counterproductive, something that events, I think, have made increasingly apparent since 9/11. Promising American safety and security, the Washington rules have produced something akin to permanent war. We are all aflutter because the latest Bob Woodward blockbuster is about to be conferred upon a grateful public. And so all the media is chattering. I guess today the verb would be twittering with excerpts from this book. One of the excerpts that I've seen in print, or in electrons, I guess, is the comment. Woodward quotes General Petraeus. I didn't write the quote down, so I won't get this exactly right, but it's about 95% right. And Petraeus is quoted as saying, I'm not sure the context, whether he's referring to Afghanistan specifically or sort of the larger conflict with al-Qaeda. But he's quoted as saying, you're nodding your head, you saw this, we can't win this war. We can't win this war. This is the commanding general of the war. We can't win this war. But this is the kind of fight, I think he refers in the quote. This is the kind of fight that we will be engaged in for years to come, and that our kids will be engaged in. Extraordinary statement. Why would one wage a war that you can't win? Why would one wage a war that you fully anticipate is going to last, apparently, for generations? The only reason I can imagine that you would do that is if you concluded that there absolutely was no way of avoiding that prospect, that there was no alternative, that there was no other choice. But then you have to scratch your head. How could it be that there is no alternative, that there is no other choice? To what degree has anybody in Washington tried to find an alternative? Or is it too inconvenient, too contrary to existing interests, to actually try to discern whether there is an alternative? So promising American safety and security, the Washington rules have produced something akin to permanent war, promising to preserve the American way of life. I mean, we are told that this enterprise is about preserving the American way of life. The Washington rules have set the United States on a course toward bankruptcy, both fiscal and moral. It is, it seems to me, starting to sink in that trillion-dollar deficits really are not sustainable. That having a national debt that is greater than the national GDP, and that day is not far off. If I'm not mistaken, the national debt has now exceeds $13 trillion. I think the total size of the economy is somewhere between 14 and 15 trillion dollars. It's not going to take many more years of trillion-dollar deficits before we look like a North American version of Argentina in its worst days. Apologies to anybody here from Argentina. Permission granted to censor the tape so that we don't offend any Argentine supporters of the council. So what should replace the existing Washington rules? Well, it seems to me that we need a new credo and we need a new Trinity. And what I would offer as a new credo is that we need to revive the conviction that America's primary purpose and obligation is to be America. What do I mean by that? That our purpose ought to be to fulfill the aspirations expressed in our founding documents, primarily the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States. Not least among those aspirations is found in the concluding words of the preamble to the Constitution, which declares, I mean, these are words that we are so familiar with, but we sort of take it for granted that they actually that the preamble is somehow simply a throat-clearing exercise before the framers of the Constitution got down to business. It's not. It is a succinct statement of what we think we are about in this union. And the concluding words state that the purpose of this union is, quote, to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. What's the key word in that phrase? Key word is posterity. The question is not necessarily, do we live in freedom? We do. The question is whether or not we are conducting our affairs such that our children and our grandchildren will be able to live in freedom. I'm a historian, I'm not a prophet. But were I a prophet, I'd bet that a couple generations from now, people will curse us for having so mismanaged our affairs, and will cause their opportunities to live in freedom to be severely circumscribed. There's a lot of talk, and there ought to be a lot of talk, especially in places like the Council, about moral obligation in public life and in international affairs. Without trying to be too sort of selfish about it, it seems to me that the primary moral obligation of the people that we elect and send to Washington, their primary obligation is to the American people. And again, notably, not simply to this generation, but to posterity. Now, if in the course of securing the blessings of liberty to ourselves and of our posterity, the United States also serves as an exemplar to others, if we can, in keeping faith with the liberal values that we profess, that we can offer something that others can use, I'd say that's a good thing. But to say that's a good thing is not to say that we should confuse what really is an ancillary benefit for central purpose. Now, when it comes to thinking about and employing military power, I also think we need a new Trinity. And I would propose that under the terms of this alternative Trinity, A, that we define the primary duty station of the American soldier as America. Primary duty station of the American soldier as America. Not sole or exclusive. There certainly will be times in which we are called upon to employ our forces abroad, but we have to view that as a departure from the norm rather than the norm. I mean, it ought to be, it's not astonishing because it's so widely accepted. It really ought to be astonishing that 60 plus years after the end of World War II, we still have U.S. forces in Germany and Japan. What exactly are the security threats that the Germans are worried about? And how is it that Germany, this robust democracy, can't handle them on their own? B, in my alternative Trinity. We have to defend U.S. forces, we have to design U.S. forces to defend the United States of America and its most vital interests. And I understand that that phrase, vital interests, is a slippery one and invites debate over what qualifies and what doesn't qualify. And I would say, to some degree, the purpose of democratic politics ought to be to have a candid argument about the limits of our vital interests. I would welcome that debate. I'd simply insist that the notion that everything is a vital interest is absurd, and for all practical purposes, that's the circumstance in which we find ourselves today. It would not surprise me at all if next week we picked up the New York Times and find some member of the Obama administration insisting that Yemen is now becoming a vital interest of the United States of America, and therefore, actually there's already a plan to provide a significantly expanded program of military assistance to the government of Yemen. And C, the third element of my alternative Trinity, would be to argue that consistent with the just war tradition, you know what the just war tradition is? The just war tradition basically is this set of norms or guidelines devised to help us render judgments about prospective or ongoing conflicts, to ascertain whether or not we should judge those conflicts as morally justifiable or not morally justifiable. Well, it seems to me that consistent with the just war tradition, we ought to employ force only as a last resort and only in self-defense. My point here is to argue that the just war tradition is not simply useful as a basis for moral thinking. It's also tremendously useful as a basis for prudential thinking about what makes sense. And even then, in employing force as a last resort and in self-defense, we should always be cognizant of the limited utility of violence as an instrument of statecraft. Its utility is not non-existent, but its utility is limited. We need to appreciate that. And further, we ought to also appreciate the fact that when we go to war, it's going to cost more than we possibly imagine, and it's going to give rise to a host of consequences that even the smartest people in the room are not going to be able to anticipate in advance. So you really are rolling the dice. There are times when you need to roll the dice, but boy, you are rolling the dice. Well, how likely is it that we will see any departure from the Washington rules? And I'm afraid to say you know the answer. And the answer is it's not very likely. Why not? Well, two reasons. The first is that Washington itself, of course, is deeply invested into maintaining the status quo, is deeply invested in this credo, the existing credo, and the existing Trinity, which does, in fact, benefit Washington, even if it does not work to the benefit of the American people. One of the other revelations, apparently in the Woodward book, that really is not a revelation, is that in that long interval during 2009, when President Obama was anguishing over what to do about Afghanistan, the Woodward book tells us what we already know, and that is that in a very fundamental and important way, the basic authority to decide was taken away from the president. The authority to decide was taken away from the president by the people who were framing the alternatives that were presented to the president. What should we do? And the alternatives that were presented to the president were three, basically, as far as we can tell. A surge with 20,000 additional troops, a surge with 30,000 additional troops, and a surge with 40,000 additional troops. Mr. President, we await your decision. And sort of, it's like Goldilocks and Three Bears, one's too hot and one's too cold, so I'll pick 30,000. And I think in a very important way, that testifies to the way Washington works in the arena of national security and helps us understand the extent to which prying Washington loose from this consensus is going to be very, very difficult. But there is a second reason, and maybe a more troubling reason, why we're unlikely to see any departure from the Washington rules, and that's this. We, the people, have been too long conditioned to believe that any departure from this status quo, that abandoning the notion that we are called upon to save the world, closing down some portion of this global empire of bases, perhaps deciding not to spend as much on our military as the rest of the world spends on their militaries, that any backing away from that, we've been conditioned to believe that the results will be a retreat into isolationism and global chaos. In other words, having been conditioned along these lines, we no longer have the ability to ask basic first-order critical questions about national security policy. And I think this tendency to defer to Washington, to defer to people who ostensibly are a lot smarter than any of us, and who certainly have access to classified information which tells them things that we're not allowed to know. This tendency to defer to Washington may well pose the greatest of all obstacles to restoring good sense to U.S. policy. So with that, I'll stop, and thank you very much for your attention.
You spoke about our moral obligation to look at these issues, so I thank you for fulfilling yours, because it really was a wonderful talk. So with that being said, I'd like to open the floor to questions and give Bob James the first.
Okay. So I support this organization, and so I get this. Thanks. Very good. Yeah. First, I wanted to say something about the book. This is a hell of a good book. You really ought to read it.
What'd you say, sir?
I said it's a very good book. A very good book. Not only that, it's easy to read. Considering it's a very, very serious book, it's easy to read. But I'm suggesting that you look at this book, get it, and work on it. Don't make it easy. Look at the footnotes. The footnotes will tell you things that you cannot believe. Alan Dulles said this. Maxwell Taylor said this. The two Kennedys said this. I cannot believe, in view of what's happened, what they said. And you should look at that and see that, and you'll get a kick out of it. So, question. We've had a couple of presidents who have pointed out that there is evil in the world. Nobody likes the way they put it. What did Reagan say? Evil empire, and then Bush said axis of evil. I happen to believe that they are correct, that there is evil out there. But the United States, if you need military arms sometimes, only the United States can project power. If you don't believe that, you've got to believe that only the United States can sustain power out there. So what do you do? Somebody's got to, maybe from time to time, you have to take care of some of this, and that's my question.
Well, let me begin by concurring, not on the quality of the book, but on this issue of evil and its existence in the world. But not simply in the world beyond our borders. I didn't write about Reinhold Niebuhr in this book. I wrote to some degree about Reinhold Niebuhr in my previous book, and one of the things that I value from the writings of Reinhold Niebuhr, who said clearly, there is evil in the world and sometimes it must be addressed. But, he continued, never fall for the illusion that you yourself and your motives are pure, because that is a recipe for moral and strategic disaster. So the first point, I mean, is to concur, but also to say, yes, but that doesn't mean that we are necessarily in this different category. And I'm not trying to play a moral equivalence game here. I'm not trying to say that, oh, I guess since we overthrew the Mossadegh regime back in 1953, that somehow means we are akin to the great totalitarian dictatorships of the 20th century. Not at all. Not at all. But simply let us be always aware of the fact that our motivations are not simply altruistic. Point number one. Point number two, I think, is, and this is where I think I would radically disagree with George W. Bush, who in the wake of 9/11 not only articulated his recognition of the existence of evil, but basically said, and we are going to go eliminate evil. And my point here is, it's not simply that evil exists, but evil is endemic. The existence of evil is a manifestation of the tragedy of history in which we find ourselves. Now, if you can't eliminate evil, what can you do with regard to evil? You can ignore it. That's not a wise course. You can do your best to find ways to cope with it, to minimize its effect, to minimize the danger that it poses. And it seems to me, in trying to figure out what do we do about evil, rather than sort of beginning with the notion, well, I guess we better go excise it, get me a carrier battle group, we ought to step back, try to evaluate where it fits in the pecking order of evil, where Hitler and Stalin are up there at number 10, judge the extent to which it demands a response, and then to try to be cool-headed in thinking about the range of alternatives which are available. The first response ought not to be a military response. And I say that absolutely conceding that there are times, there have been times, and there will be times when you need to opt for war. My own sense is that as this national security consensus that I have described has embedded itself in the way Washington thinks, and especially since the end of the Cold War, when the notion that we were the almighty superpower took hold, that we've been too quick to reach for the gun and pull the trigger. And we ought not to do that.
What's that? You hold it? Okay. Edith Everett, one of the big problems on the horizon is Iran these days. What do you suppose is happening in Washington in terms of the discussion of what to do, if to do? And by the way, thank you very much for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you. Well, I can say anything I want to say because I have no idea what they're actually talking about and thinking about in Washington. I don't have any kind of inside information. But my guess would be the following. We already have too much war and too few warriors. We really don't need another war. I imagine that President Obama is acutely aware of that, not simply because yet another war wouldn't make a heck of a lot of sense, but also because we're entering the season in which his sensitivity to domestic political considerations is going to become more, it will rise to the fore. He's going to have a hard enough time winning a second term with a 9+% unemployment rate, and the people who elected him not really all that gung-ho on the fact that we are about to enter the 10th year of the Afghanistan war. So I would think that President Obama would not be enthusiastic about pushing the problem with Iran to the point where there is violence. I imagine that as they think about the Iranian problem, they have to think very seriously about the fact that the government of Israel perceives the problem somewhat differently than we do. I personally do not believe that Iran poses an existential threat to the United States of America. Were I an Israeli Jew, I might have a different view of that. And the history of the State of Israel, which is one where they have seldom shown great patience in the eyes of a brewing security threat, and in which has seen Israel developing very sophisticated military capabilities, certainly means that from a U.S. perspective, the possibility of an Israeli preemptive strike has to be viewed as a live option. I think we have an enormous interest in preventing Israel from doing that. No, I don't mean prevent. We can't prevent them from doing anything. They're going to do what they want to do, of trying to dissuade them from doing that. And frankly, from the Israeli perspective, it's not an easy call, because to start a war with Iran, which could very likely induce an Iranian response that would put U.S. forces at risk in Iraq and Afghanistan, could, from an Israeli perspective, put the Israeli-U.S. relationship in some jeopardy. And from an Israeli perspective, that's bad news. I mean, the government of Israel, I think, already views itself increasingly as isolated and under siege, and anything, therefore, that could undercut the relationship with the United States would be disastrous. So even to the extent that they view the Iranian program as representing an existential threat, that doesn't mean that it's an easy call for them to deal with it. So that's part of the problem. Now, the truth is, of course, we don't know if the Iranians are developing a nuclear weapon, and they deny that they are. I have said that were I the Iranian National Security Advisor, I would favor the development of a nuclear weapon, because from the Iranian perspective, they got real national security problems, and national security problem number one is the United States of America. And there's plenty, I think there's considerable evidence that you can get in big trouble trying to develop a nuclear weapon, but once you succeed in developing a nuclear weapon, then you get to play by different rules. Then you become like North Korea, you become like Pakistan. So from the Iranian perspective, there's great risk in having a program. There may be considerable payoff if you can pull this thing off. Where am I in the bottom line? The bottom line is, I think that the idea of imposing sanctions on them in order to try to get them to reveal their nuclear program, whether it's benign or not benign, is smart. It may not work. At a minimum, it's a way of trying to persuade the government of Israel that we do take this thing relatively seriously. If 6 months from now or a year from now, the Iranians test a weapon, then it seems to me that what makes sense is for us to implement a strategy of deterrence. Okay, you guys got a nuclear weapon. Use it. It'll be the last thing that happens in Iran. That's the basic posture that we used vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. It's very difficult, I think, at this remove to be able to evaluate entirely clearly the extent to which the strategy of deterrence shaped Soviet behavior, or whether Soviet behavior was shaped by other considerations. The strategy of deterrence is based on the assumption of rationality on the part of your adversary. And of course, there are people who would say that Mr. Ahmadinejad, who was here yesterday, explaining that we perpetrated the 9/11 attacks, is viewed in some quarters as a total nut job. There's an argument that says that if there's a nuclear button, it's not his finger that's on it. That basic decisions about national security policy are made by the mullahs. My bet is that the mullahs are likely to be rational and therefore deterrable. Again, that's a bet by an American when the United States would not be directly threatened. And I can understand that other countries might view that prospective threat differently. And there's no easy answer here.
Ernest Rubinstein, is it realistic to assume any change in the Washington rules, in particular the projection of American power overseas, so long as the United States is overwhelmingly dependent on oil from troubled areas around the world?
Well, certainly our refusal to have a serious energy policy. Remember, we are old enough to remember Operation Independence, declared by Richard M. Nixon at the time of the first oil shocks. It was Nixon who said, this cannot stand. We have to, every president since then has said, yes, yes. And we still haven't done anything serious about it. It's really a remarkable statement about our politics, that here we are, lo these, 40 years later, and we're still arguing about whether or not we ought to deal with this problem. But I don't think that's really sort of the cornerstone of the issue. I mean, if the question began, can we do it? Why can't something be done about the Washington rules, or what could cause something to be done about the Washington rules? I think the big problem is that most of us, are completely insulated from the consequences of misguided policies. We are insulated in two respects. The first, of course, is that having abandoned the concept of a citizen soldier and opted for our professional army, what the founders would have called a standing army, something that the founders were greatly concerned about, we find ourselves in this condition of essentially permanent war, and the burden of service and sacrifice falls on roughly 0.5% of the American people. It's not amusing, it's actually quite sad to listen to a politician in Washington, President Obama himself has done this, say something to the effect that this nation is at war. This nation is not at war. I mean, the United States Army and the United States Marine Corps, supported by the United States Air Force and the United States Navy, those people are at war. But for the great majority of the American people, contact with those people is actually minimum. We support the troops by cheering for the troops. We don't support the troops by insisting that we will share in the sacrifices that they are making in our name. As long as that continues to be the case, then I think that that helps to sustain the Washington rules. And the second piece is we don't even pay for the wars that are waged in our names. It's all borrowed money. It's astonishing. If you go back and look at the speeches that Franklin Roosevelt made, this is even before Pearl Harbor, but after the declaration of a national emergency and the country was beginning to gear up for whatever the future held, Franklin Roosevelt was quite candid in saying that sacrifice will be required of all of us. They raised taxes. I just read the other day that the highest tax rate during World War II, I think, was 93%. I don't advocate 93%. But the point is, and it's not true that the American people paid for all of the costs of World War II. There was a substantial increase in debt, but the American people sure tried to pay for World War II, the war that was conducted in their name. What we have is tax cuts, and now one of the political issues of the moment, arguing how to render permanent these tax cuts. I mean, I don't care. I mean, the argument that's made by the Democrats, I guess, is if you repeal the tax cuts for the people in the highest income brackets, which, by the way, includes university professors, that you can save $700 billion over the course of 10 years. That's not exactly chump change. But on the other hand, it really doesn't get to the core issue. The core issue is we are living so far beyond our means that it's obscene. But that, too, we don't feel. We don't have a skin in the game. It is not affecting our daily way of life today. I mean, I've argued in print that if you divide up, I think the war costs are in round numbers, this is round numbers now. War costs are about $400 billion a year if you total up everything. And if you divide that by the number of tax-paying households, single and joint filers, and if we paid for the war costs, that would, for the average, obviously it would be depending on income level, for the average tax-paying household, our income tax would go up every year by $3,300. do that, and the American people will recognize that there's a problem here with perpetual war. But of course, the Congress won't do that. And to tell you the truth, we don't want the Congress to do that. We want to continue to play along with this illusion that somehow there are no financial or fiscal or economic consequences of this level of military activity.
Thank you, sir. When you finish writing books, William Verdone, thank you. When you finish writing books and retire, you should do stand-up comedy. Or perhaps at our age, sit-down comedy. But nevertheless, my question is, with your revised impressions of the Credo and the Trinity, I get the feeling that it is maybe for foreign perception of dampening down American arrogance. I wonder if you can comment on that.
I didn't quite, could you just say that again in different words? I don't think I understood.
Your revised Credo and Trinity. It
Yeah.
seems that it is dampening down foreign perception of American arrogance, where we always seem to be.
Okay. I mean, were Washington to adopt my rules, would one effect be to reduce the perception abroad that we are too full of ourselves? Could be that would be one result. That would not be in particular why I would advocate what I'm advocating. I'd advocate what I'm advocating because I think it's in our best interest. I think there's a huge, well, substantial risk. The assumption one assumption that underlies my counter-proposal, my new national security consensus, is that the world will learn to adjust. The world will learn to find mechanisms, arrangements that will avoid blowing up the planet without having the United States have a military presence in however many dozen countries. I mean, the assumption is that, invited to do so, Europe can find a way to provide for its own security. And, to be candid, there are some people who say, well, there's plenty of evidence that Europe can't do that. They would say, have you forgotten Bosnia? Remember, that was supposed to be the hour of Europe, and they screwed it up. And they did. I would not take that failure of Europe at that particular juncture as somehow definitive. When I say, for example, and I do say, we should pull out of NATO. Let NATO be a European alliance that exists for the purpose of defending Europe. Let's have NATO not be an alliance that exists for the purpose of pacifying Afghanistan. When I say pull out of NATO, I don't mean pull out of NATO next Tuesday. I mean here in the year 2010, tell them that in the year 2020, the U.S. will withdraw its forces from Europe and will withdraw from the alliance. So you Brits and you Germans and you French people and you Belgiques, you've got a decade to figure it out. And I think told in advance that reflects our intention and offered time and opportunity to figure out what approach to European defense they would have to take if it's on their own, I think they probably could be counted on to figure that out.
Sandra Stein, thank you so much for a terribly needed voice in the public dialogue. I was thinking when you discussed Iran and Israel, hadn't thought of this before, but if miraculously they somehow make a deal between the Palestinians and Israelis, wouldn't that take away any justification for Iran? Not that they have any, but any supposed justification for Iran to be a threat to Israel?
Yes, but, and I think you actually phrased the question in the correct way. And the issue here is what is the larger significance of the Israeli-Palestinian dispute, and how should we view it? Obviously, it is a great tragedy for the two peoples that are locked in this perpetual conflict, which costs both sides in different ways, but costs both sides, I think, pretty significantly. My view is that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict matters to us in that for decades now, Arabs, more broadly nations, governments in the Muslim world, have cited the grievances of the Palestinian as the basis for anti-Israeli or anti-Western policies and behavior. And certainly, since the rise of al-Qaeda, the violent jihadists cite the grievances of the Palestinian as providing some amount of moral justification for this campaign that they are engaged in. I'm not an expert on this, but as much as I've read, I'm not believing that these Arab or Muslim or governments or al-Qaeda genuinely are motivated by concerns for the Palestinian. It is a convenient pretext. And I think from a U.S. perspective, we do have a profound interest in taking away that moral pretext for their actions. Particularly with respect to al-Qaeda and similar organizations, what we want to do is to make as clear as possible that there is no conceivable justification for the violence that they wage against the West, with 9/11, of course, as the preeminent example of that. So to settle the Israeli-Palestinian dispute is to strip that away. That doesn't mean that as soon as that happens, were it to happen, that then all the Arab countries and Muslim countries would say, the Americans are our friends. Let's bury the hatchet. We've been brothers for so long. I don't think that for a second. I think that there are all kinds of reasons in which interests are at odds with one another. So the benefit here is a limited but very real benefit of making clear, particularly in the context of terrorism, a moral. It enables us to differentiate in the moral realm. That's what I think. That's why I think it really is exceedingly important for us to try to get that dispute settled, although I'm deeply pessimistic because I think the amount of leverage we actually have to bring to the problem is far less than the more hopeful commentators seem to believe.
This has been so interesting. Thank you so much. My name is Susan Rudin, and my question is, the New York City Police Department has offices in almost every major city of the world, which I don't know exactly what they do, but I think they're fact-finding for the protection of New York City. Is that a model for what you would consider for Washington? And do other cities have the same kind of outreach into Rome, Amsterdam, Berlin?
Ma'am, I honestly don't know. I did not know that the New York City Police Department had that kind of a presence. I would assume that it's a liaison function with foreign intelligence services to try to facilitate the exchange of information that somehow suggests that there's a pending threat to New York. I didn't know that happened, and I don't know what my opinion would be. I mean, frankly, if every major city in the United States had a police liaison to every foreign capital, I'm afraid that the result would be to clog things up rather than to facilitate this exchange of intelligence that I would presume would be the idea. I was not aware of that. My wife and I are definitely aware of the fact that you sure have a lot of cops in this city. Just coming from Penn Station today, they are just. And it's a very. If you're not from here, truly, it's a. You probably sort of get used to it, but the police presence is. I know it's the UN thing, but I mean the police presence is just striking.
And Obama's here today, too, so that's
Right.
Sylvan?
Tell us an Ernest King story,
No.
but one where you cannot use any colorful language.
Every time he came into the chart room, the war room, I had to turn the fan off because it was bald. He didn't like a draft on his head. Thank you very much for a wonderful speech, and thank you for your kind words about me. I'd like to go back to Eisenhower 101. Beware of the military-industrial complex. And we got into trouble over, and he also warned about being involved on the mainland of Asia. And we got involved, and we screwed up, and McNamara finally had to write a mea culpa about how he was wrong about everything. Interventionism. Would you say interventionism is higher on the East Coast here than in other parts of the country? We seem to have a mindset in the East Coast here that's totally different from the mindset on the West Coast.
Well, I don't know. There are certainly, I think there's a general perception among historians that back in the time of your youth, there was a greater enthusiasm for intervention on the coasts than there was in what we today call the heartland. That's where my wife and I grew up, in the heartland. When I was a kid, I read the Chicago Tribune when Colonel McCormick, a fantastic but forgotten, somewhat weird figure, was the long-term publisher of the Chicago Tribune, and he was, quite frankly, an isolationist. And to some degree, McCormick's isolationism did, I think, reflect a skepticism in the Midwest that was very much part of the Midwest at that time.
And anti-British.
Also anti-British. And in certain quarters, anti-Semitic. My own sense is today, whether or not these regional, my guess would be the regional distinctions are not as sharp as they once were. And yet, I think that there are elements of that Midwestern anti-interventionist tradition. Some elements, not the anti-Semitic piece of it. But there was a skepticism about whether or not we had the capacity to remake the world. Frankly, an aversion to big armies that I think was part of this then regional tradition that we ought to revisit today. Not on a regional basis, but that as Americans we can recognize, if the Midwestern tradition lost the argument in the latter half of the 20th century, by the time we get to the post-World War II period, everybody is an internationalist. So if they lost the argument in the second half of the 20th century, the fact that they lost the argument doesn't mean that every point that they were making was illegitimate. So it seems to me today when we might want to revisit that tradition and to discern whether or not there's anything to be salvaged. I wrote a review essay I don't know, was it 6 months ago now? No, I'm sorry. I wrote a review. I got a review essay coming out later this month in a journal called Raritan. It's published at Rutgers. About a group of Midwestern historians who, all of them deceased now, who I think said things that ought to resonate today. And what they were saying really reflected a wariness of globalism, a wariness of having a determination to save the world actually become a pretext for imperial behavior. And just, I think those are sentiments that still have a place.
I'd like just to take these two last questions together, and then the last word, if you want.
My name is Mike Sponda. This would be a philosophical one on the Washington rules. If the Heritage Foundation was smart enough to invite you to one of their meetings, how do you think that the questions would come to you, and what kind of people would you be addressing to? Because they are Washington rules under your definition.
Well, I'm sorry.
Okay. I wanted to ask what, I see a problem, I could be wrong. There's it appears to me, a resurgent militant form of Islam, which is dragging in its wake other forms of atavistic tribal belief and behavior. I understand that the reservations and the problems with our current courses of action that we're pursuing to deal with this problem, but I wonder if you agree with me at all that this is a real problem and not just a chimera or something that maybe pops up on the radar screen, hopefully once a decade or so. What do we do about it if we don't do what we're doing now?
Well, on the first point, the Heritage Foundation is not going to invite me to come talk to them. So they would find all of this disagreeable and probably not worth serious consideration. I would want to, in terms of the threat, I would want to distinguish between two different elements. The first element is the existence of terrorist networks, with al-Qaeda being probably the prime example. Emphatically, it is a threat. It's not an existential threat. The notion that al-Qaeda, that Osama bin Laden is going to create some new caliphate and take over the entire Islamic world and embark upon some global jihad is preposterous. Because what he has on offer actually has, I think, fairly limited appeal to the 1.4 billion people of the Islamic world. So it's important to recognize that al-Qaeda is a threat. It is important not to overstate that threat. I think that the notion created by the George W. Bush administration that the best way to deal with this threat is to invade and occupy countries, waging open-ended war, is demonstrably not going to produce success, and that the argument that many people, I think, have now made, that we should view it as a police problem, has great merit. An international police problem, a mafia that in one way or another draws some of its energy from by warping a religious tradition. Piece number one. Piece number two is this larger crisis in the Islamic world, where it does, speaking as somebody who has minimal expertise with regard to Islam, it really does seem to me that there is within the Islamic world there's a great crisis, the root of which is the challenge of reconciling a particular religious tradition with modernity. How can I be a faithful Muslim and also live in the Islamic world? Excuse me, live in the modern world? And that this posed significant challenges in what used to be called Christendom a couple hundred years ago, and led to a considerable amount of violence in the West, has been mostly resolved, but not entirely resolved in the West. If we look at Reverend Terry, what's his name, Mr. International Burn a Quran Day. And I think that it's going to take a considerable period of time for this crisis to be resolved in the Islamic world, and they're going to have to do it on their own. Indeed, I would say that to the extent that we interfere in their affairs and basically assert that we can fix their problems, we probably make things worse. Because the appearance is, whether we wish to acknowledge it or not, is that we are simply infidels who are continuing the behavior of Western imperial powers in the Islamic world for a couple of centuries. There, I think, the response is to re-envision a strategy of containment that will insulate us from any effects of this internal crisis as it plays itself out. And that's a strategy of containment that doesn't look like the strategy of containment that was put together during the Cold War, but it's based on the same expectation that the problem will resolve itself over a long period of time because internal contradictions on the other side will sort themselves out. That's also a strategy that says we're going to live with this problem for a very considerable period of time. So thanks very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you.